Hello and welcome back to General Humanities 1. Today we are talking about probably one of the most niche subjects we're going to cover in General Humanities 1 in my particular class. Yes, we are going to talk about the Byzantine and the Islamic empires. The way I'm organizing our discussion of the medieval world is first recovering Christianity, because again, that's going to have a lot of influence over the entire medieval perspective, especially in Europe. But I do want to spend a substantial amount of time, as much as I can afford to, honestly, talking about the other side of the Middle Ages, the stories that do not show up in American textbooks, the business that frequently gets just whitewashed right out of one's history classes. And I do want to emphasize this. Like, when people talk about the Dark Ages, the very name Dark Ages implies Eurocentrism. That the world has gone dark, and the reason why the world has gone dark is because the Roman Empire has fallen, and Europe is no longer the center of the universe, and, like, nothing matters at this point. Which is ridiculous. A lot of cultures are doing a lot of really cool things. It just so happens that it's not Europeans that are the center of attention at this point. Now, this is complicated. The fact of the matter is that Rome's fall did sort of dramatically change the organization of the world during this period right after Rome's fall. I'm not going to pretend like any of the cultures that we're talking about today can rival the Roman Empire as far as pure, bureaucratic stability or infrastructural achievements or any of the buildings that they created. As much as we've been focusing on the Roman Empire, we've been focusing primarily on their abilities in literature and poetry and mythology, and not so much just the sheer we built all of the roads and aqueducts and bridges and just basic infrastructural achievements that continue to persist in Europe to this day. Like, as much as, we've sort of focused on Roman architectural achievements, especially in the Khan Academy videos, is like buildings and temples, honestly, the real legacy that's going to last for thousands of years is like people just have these aqueducts sitting in their backyard and they don't know what to do with them. Or these bridges that have just been there for, in some cases 1,000 years or more, and they're just like alternately either using them regularly and not questioning it, or like stealing stone and material from it in order to build their own homes. This is a reality of Europeans in the Middle Ages, and it is a reality for much of the rest of the world as well. But what I want to stress today is that while Europe is indeed going through a period of some, I don't even know what to call it. Like, they've moved backwards in some ways. Like, I even hesitate to say that because, as we'll see, there's plenty of really interesting medieval poetry and medieval literature and medieval art that is worth talking about and frequently doesn't get talked about. At the end of the day, like, what we're really talking about here, what the essential issue is with the end of the Roman Empire and the fall of Rome, is a lack of record keeping. We, in many cases, and in all of these cultures that we're going to be talking about today, notwithstanding, in all of these cases, we're talking about a dramatic decrease in the amount of written record. Like, some of the languages, as they're transforming from Latin to the various Romance languages, modern-day French, modern-day Spanish, modern-day Romanian, even English to some degree, these languages are often, like, troubling to try and translate. Like, where we have written texts, they're often in a dialect that we don't necessarily understand as well as we would, the usual, like Roman Latin. But also, with that lack of organization comes a lack of interest in record keeping. Nobody's writing history the way that they did during the Roman Empire. Nobody is, keeping track of all of these rises and falls of various leaders or organizations the way that they were in the Roman Empire. There are historical accounts of who's in charge of Britain during this period, who's in charge of France during this period. The trouble is that most of those historical accounts are either unreliable, written well after the fact, or just, are half, caught up with myth in the first place, like the stories of King Arthur. But for all that, I want to stress, it's not as simple as Rome fell and the world as we knew it entered purely a dark age. we are going to talk about the two cultures that very much dominated this period from, let's call it 500 AD or CE to roughly 1000 AD or CE. And we will look beyond that as well. But during this period between the fall of Rome and the Crusades, in fact, the Islamic world and the Byzantine world tended to thrive here. It took the Muslims to get a little while to get on their feet and create a sort of like historical legacy, which we'll talk about later. But the Byzantines, remember, the Roman Empire didn't fall for them. Like, yeah, Rome itself fell, but Constantinople survived. However, much as I am excited to talk about this stuff, much as I want to sort of like broaden your view of history and look at some of the stuff that our culture tends to devalue as far as history is concerned, I gotta tell you, I am a product of the Eurocentric mind or worldview. Like, when I was in college, we did not study either of these empires. The first I heard about the Byzantines was when I was in my master's, and we were literally studying the tradition of the Church Fathers, and we read Basil Tatakis's, what is it? The Christian philosophy in the patristic and Byzantine tradition, which, when I sold my book, I felt really guilty about it, and then went and tried to find it again and could not for like less than $100. So again, we're talking about like a tradition, a field of scholarship that you have to kind of deliberately break into. And I have been. For the last few years, I've been making a very concerted effort to learn more, especially about the Islamicate world, because everything that I learn about it just makes me more fascinated by it. But I am not formally trained in talking about any of this stuff. This is all stuff I've figured out just with some pretty extensive, rigorous research after my collegiate career. This is not something I ever specialized in. This is not something I would claim to be authoritative about. So with that in mind, let's talk about the Byzantines. Let's talk about the Islamic world. And I want to start where we left off last time. Rome is falling. The Roman Empire has been divided into West and East. We will talk about the fate of the West next time. This time we are talking about the fate of the Eastern Empire, specifically what we will go on to call the Byzantine Empire. Now again, as you know, if you've watched the Khan Academy videos, the Crash Course videos I've assigned at this point, you already know that the Byzantines do not consider themselves to be a separate empire. They call themselves Romans, they consider themselves Romans, even though they're speaking Greek and basically like have, you know, cut themselves off from Rome as a whole. They consider themselves part of the same legacy. Like Justinian considers it just fit in the 6th century when he conquers Rome and most of Italy and restores the Roman Empire to its supposed former glory, though this is very short-lived. For generations to come, like into the 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, and 11th centuries, you're going to still find Greek-speaking Romans living in Constantinople who have never been to Rome, never seen Rome, who consider Rome a, like, sort of quasi-hostile, you know, entity. The trip there is excruciatingly dangerous and no one is willing to make it. And yet they will consider themselves the proper inheritors of the Roman Empire. For the Byzantines, Rome did not fall, and the fact that we call them the Byzantine Empire is more a scholastic convenience than an actual, like, diagnosis of who they were and what they believed. Again, like, when we talk about the Greeks, there is something misleading about talking about the Greeks, because for most of Greek history, the Greeks did not consider themselves a unified people. Likewise, when we talk about the Byzantines, we're kind of doing them an injustice too, because we are in fact talking about them as though they are not the, you know, Roman Empire, because, you know, Rome fell, and therefore the Roman Empire is over at that point. Which, again, history's weird, folks. Like, pay attention to what's going on the ground just as much as you pay attention to all the fancy maps that I throw at you. Now, again, I want to sort of pick up our discussion of the Byzantines around the 6th century, again, right at this moment where Justinian has taken over most of the Roman Empire, has reunited Carthage and Rome with Constantinople. But at the same time, I want to stress, like, as much as Justinian's accomplishments here are very impressive, it is extremely short-lived. Like, I'm pretty sure Rome falls within Justinian's lifetime, and he does not live long after this anyway. Like, plague very much gets him over the next couple of decades. So by the 6th, or the beginning of the 7th century CE, like right around 600, you better believe that, like, Rome and the Roman Empire, as the Byzantines have it, has already contracted substantially. For the most part, when we talk about the Byzantines, we're going to be cutting it off basically at Greece, maybe Egypt, though again it depends on like how far into the Islamic conquest we are. The key to the Byzantines, though, is always Constantinople. We say that the Byzantine Empire survives so long as Constantinople stands. So when the Ottomans take it in the 15th century, that is officially the end of the Byzantines, and that is officially the end of the Roman Empire, so to speak. But that said, I want to talk about Justinian. Again, Justinian is the standout, most important emperor of the Byzantine world. Like, no other emperor is going to surpass him. And in a very real sense, like, Justinian is the last great Roman emperor, if we assume that sort of continuity of leadership, that continuity of authority and organization. After Justinian, things fall apart pretty quickly. There are a couple of tyrannical emperors who kind of make a mess of things. And as much as, you know, you would think that a tyrannical emperor would be aggressively trying to expand, they can't. Like, there's too little money, too little power, too few people. Like, the Byzantine Empire very much just immediately falls into decline after Justinian. They still have a lot of great cultural accomplishments, and they still are extremely influential, like especially their conversion of Russia to Orthodoxy is a kind of big deal, even if we're not going to talk about it very much. So we are going to talk about, like, the little details as we go along, but I gotta stress, this is the peak, folks. Justinian's, like, efforts to both reconquer the Roman Empire, to sort of build new buildings, new infrastructure, to reorganize, especially the law of the Roman Empire, which at this point is, like, scattered across a whole bunch of different legal traditions and legal codes. His effort to, like, consolidate them into one Justinian code, like, honestly, this alone is a huge marker of his legacy. Most European nations, most Western nations in general, and some well beyond the West, have adopted the Justinian Code in some respect, or are adapting the Justinian Code in some respect. Like, this is the foundation of Western law in a way that, you know, even in many of our other conversations, even when we talk about the importance of this era or the classical world as being, like, foundational to the rest of the world, like, it is rare that you get to see something so concrete, so important, so pivotal to the development of the modern world. Like, the Justinian Code really is the backbone on which all modern legal codes are based. But that's hardly the end of Justinian's accomplishments. Like, under him, you know, again, the Hagia Sophia, like, is destroyed for the second time on Justinian's watch, but this time he's going to build it right. Like, he dedicates a whole bunch of money to the enterprise, hires the best architects that he can find, and the temple that he builds, like, is one of the most impressive architectural wonders of the world today. Like, this is a masterpiece. And again, the Khan Academy video does much better than I can, like, talking about its features. I have to emphasize, though, that as much as, like, we look at it now and this is what it looks like, its life has been one of upheaval and change. Like, never mind the fact that this is, like, Hagia Sophia or like the Christian Church of Constantinople Mark III, due to all of the earthquakes and all of the upheaval before this. The Hagia Sophia has also, like, been transformed since it's been a thing. Both, you know, as a Christian temple, but also, like, in being adopted by the Ottoman Turks and being converted into a mosque, and then again when, like, with the establishment of the nation of Turkey, like, being transformed into a secular museum. And I honestly hear, like, that there is discussion, if not actual movement, towards turning it into a mosque again. So, you know, it has changed a lot over the years, and it almost certainly will change a lot over the years. Its symbolic significance is too great to be ignored. It is one of those just architectural landmarks that is so valuable and so important to history, to, like, culture, that at this point I imagine the preservation efforts will continue no matter who's running the show. And the only danger that it faces is, as a symbol of this magnitude, one day it may be destroyed for symbolic reasons, the same way as many symbols frequently do. But again, as a monument to Justinian's legacy, as a monument to the sort of height of the Byzantine Empire, it is hardly to be paralleled. Like, there's a reason why I ended up having you watch not one but two videos covering the Hagia Sophia, and why it comes up so frequently in our discussions. But at the same time, I want to sort of like draw your attention to a countercultural movement in the Byzantine world. And this isn't like specifically a Byzantine phenomenon either. In the first few centuries of Christian development, a lot of Christians, like, I won't say a lot as in a majority, but a lot as in a lot of individuals, like hundreds of people would occasionally like take off and just go live in the desert for one reason or another. Remember, as we talked about in Matthew and in the Sermon on the Mount in particular, there's all that emphasis on if you are receiving some kind of worldly reward that will somehow like offset or diminish the reward that you receive in heaven. Like, again, it's not explicitly stated here that there is like a direct relationship, but it's often interpreted that way. If anything, the emphasis seems to be that like God is going to reward you for what you are honestly. But there are a lot of Christians who see the world as being somehow opposed to them or opposed to the faith. And consequently, their reaction is to leave the world as much as they possibly can. So a bunch of these hermits go off into the desert and start trying to live independently of the rest of the world. Like, they don't trust the Christian churches, they don't trust the schismatic violence, they want to be as alone as possible. And the Christian world tends to support this. Like, people give them alms, they give them food, they make the effort to, like, support them, because, again, Christianity very much emphasizes, support the poor, support the weak, support those who, need help, who need support. And gradually, like, these people become an institution in their own right. These are the first monks in some respect. But our guy here, St. Benedict of Nursia, he comes up with the idea that, like, if there are so many people doing this, so many hermits wandering off into the wilderness, they should form communities. Which sounds kind of counterintuitive at the end of the day. Like, okay, so I want to separate myself from the world as much as possible, therefore I should, like, hang out with a bunch of people who are trying to do the same. But Benedict does this because, again, like, as much as, people wandering off to the wilderness to try and escape the temptations of everyday life is a major part of Christianity and has been for basically as long as Christianity has been a thing, it's also significant that, like, if you do wander off and sort of take control of your life in this way, you run into the danger of, again, kind of being an egomaniac, a solipsist. Like, we've talked about that danger ever since the Stoics, and, monks in particular are especially stoically inclined, and consequently run the danger of solipsism, run into the fear or the concern that they are just doing what they want to do instead of doing what God wants them to do. So by giving them a community, by giving them organization, Benedict offers a solution to both problems. You can, in fact, continue to be separate from the rest of the world, but you can also still be subservient, still, pay attention to the demands that are placed on you by a community. You can be alone and also serve others at the same time. So Benedict creates a code. And this code becomes the backbone of monasticism throughout the Christian world. And while we usually associate monks with, like monasteries in Europe, we should stress that in the Orthodox world, the monasteries are no less impressive, no less important, and no less of a countercultural force. If the clergy under the Byzantine Empire is a little suspect because the emperor is always in charge of the clergy, like the emperor of the Roman Empire, the Byzantine emperor, gets to always appoint every new bishop of Constantinople, the new patriarch of Constantinople, and thus essentially set the code for the entire Orthodox Church. The monks have no connection to the emperor. The emperor cannot affect them in any way. And as monasteries thrive, become more powerful, become richer, which they do, like, as much as we think of monks as being like a bunch of dudes hanging out together in some far-off place, these buildings, these communities tended to be rich and powerful because they provided a lot of services to the community. Like, here are a whole bunch of people who can read in your illiterate society. Here are a whole bunch of people who have preserved scientific and philosophical records in your, illiterate society. They tend to be pretty inventive. They have a lot of time on their hands. They frequently, tax the local community and are therefore fairly wealthy. And these monasteries typically become fortresses in their own right. Like, when they start accumulating relics and, wealth, they become targets for bandits and invading armies and Vikings and you name it. And consequently, they fortify these monasteries and these become protective institutions in another sense, fortresses. So it becomes impossible for the emperor to control these people. They are autonomous communities and they are designed for autonomy in a very real sense. So, as in the Catholic world, as we'll talk about, here in the Orthodox world, the monks exert a certain amount of influence on the rest of the world. They continue to translate, they continue to work on scholarly subjects, they continue to work with philosophers and literature, they frequently produce commentaries on other great works, like especially in the Byzantine world, the Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, which there's a whole conversation to be had there about why the Byzantines are still into Homer, but that's another conversation for another day. All this to say that I want to stress, monks are going to be important for the duration of the medieval world, and much of the literature, much of the scholarship, much of the writing we see happening comes from the monks. They are arguably the counterweight, the offset to the clerical power that exists in the Byzantine world, in the emperor and the patriarch, and in the Catholic world to the pope and the clergy. So just keep this in mind, because again, as the world is transforming, as Islam is gradually taking over the world that used to be controlled by the Roman Empire, the world that used to be controlled by Alexander the Great, the Byzantine Empire in particular is fracturing. Don't get me wrong, there's going to be some dramatic effects on medieval Europe as well. We'll talk about that in its own right. But because this is happening in the Byzantine Empire's backyard, again, this is a map of the early expansions in, the 7th century CE. This is within 100 years of, Justinian controlling, more of the Roman Empire than, will ever be controlled again. Within 100, 150 years, the Muslims have effectively destroyed most of that Byzantine Empire and reduced them to just, the Greek peninsula and the surrounding area, the Macedonian world, as well as Anatolia and the Turkish world, though give it time, they will constantly be threatening them. It also just becomes standard operating procedure that the Arabs, the Arab Muslims and the Byzantines, the Christian Byzantines, are frequently at odds with each other. They're always skirmishing, they're always going to war. For 1,000 years, we're just going to see these two at each other's throats until the Byzantines finally fall. But there is a real consequence for this to the Byzantines and especially to the Orthodox Church. Yes, the monasteries are fortresses, and in general, Islam isn't interested in, destroying communities of Christians or Jews. I know that we tend to have a fairly different perspective on Islam here in the year of our Lord 2025, but I gotta tell you, Islam is super tolerant of the other Abrahamic religions. It's evident in the Quran, it's evident in the Hadith, it's evident in their policies. When they take over new territory, they usually leave the Christian and Jewish communities intact. There's a certain amount of harassment that goes around with that, and there's a certain amount of prejudice that the Muslims have towards these Christian and Jewish communities, but it doesn't change the fact that these Christian and Jewish communities tend to be pretty influential in the Islamic world. But from the Byzantine perspective, they are cut off. The Orthodox Church at this point is structured around those 4 major urban centers that are also centers of Christianity in the Eastern world. Like we talked about last time, the 5 are Rome, which has already been cut off by, the barbarian invasions and the fall of Rome itself, but also Jerusalem, Alexandria in Egypt, Antioch in sort of southern Anatolia, and then finally Constantinople itself. And Constantinople is meant to be sort of like the head of these four patriarchs, the first among equals, as it's usually described. So when the Islamic conquest starts taking place and these various cities and communities fall to the Islamic world, often by choice, like, I gotta stress, as much as, you know, I'm framing it as though, like, the Islamic world is conquering these people, in many cases, they're just, like, willingly giving themselves up to Muslim supervision because the rule of the emperors has become so odious to so many of these communities and just intolerant. Like, again, the later emperors after Justinian tend to be pretty tyrannical. Consequently, like, these communities stop communicating with the Constantinople church. So this is where you get this many schisms in the Orthodox Church. Like, yeah, we frequently talk about the Great Schism, where officially, like, the Roman Catholic Church and the Eastern Orthodox Church separate from one another in the 11th century. But I gotta tell you, like, that was well underway long before the 11th century. Like, calling it the Great Schism as though it happened at this one moment is kind of a joke. At that point, like, Rome and Constantinople could barely talk to one another, and this is the real issue between the two churches. But in that time, again, especially since the 7th century, you'll notice that, like, the various churches that used to be Byzantine, that used to be part of the Orthodox Church, churches like the Church in Egypt, the Coptic Church, or the Church in Syria, the Syriac Church, or the Armenian Church, these churches are either conquered by Islam or turn themselves over to Islam, are now cut off from one another, and proceed independently of Constantinople as a unifying force, as well as independent of one another in many cases. So that means that they recognize different saints, they recognize different theological prerogatives, they are effectively separate. And it is only well after this, like after the 16th century, you know, after, you know, the modern world is starting to come about, that these Orthodox churches start to intentionally make the effort to reunite, to sort of reconnect all of these various churches that used to be affiliated with one another, and to sort of unify them so as to present an alternative to the unified power of the Catholic Church on the one hand, and the sort of like unity and disunity of the Protestant Church on the other hand. So if you are familiar with Christianity and know these schisms, like, you are aware of the fact that there is like a Russian Orthodox Church, or like a Greek Orthodox Church, or a Coptic Church, or an Armenian Orthodox Church, and you're not entirely sure what the deal is, that's the deal. The Catholics always have had their Pope, have always been centered in Rome. We'll talk about that more later. The Protestant Church has never been centralized, like, was very much just a process of separation. We won't talk about that at all because that's outside of our purview, but if you take General Humanities 2, it'll definitely come up. But here in General Humanities 1, the Greek Orthodox Church is the one that, you know, is separating and changing and metamorphosing due to all of these churches sort of being split off at one point or another. This is how the Orthodox Church becomes the sort of scattered thing that it is today. Now, with that in mind, the Russian Orthodox Church has its own sort of story behind it, specifically, like, the Greek Orthodox Church, again, the one in Constantinople, was sort of reaching out to the Russians because they were their neighbors to the north and seemed a lot friendlier than the Muslim Arabs to the south and east. And as a consequence, like, the Russians very much adopted Christianity through Orthodoxy, but they also didn't have a written language, so, like, St. Basil, I think it is, literally created the Russian script. Like, if you notice, Russian letters and the Russian alphabet look awfully similar to Greek Cyrillic letters and alphabet, because basically they just took the same letters and adapted them to the Russian language. It's messy and much more complicated than this, but the Russian Orthodox Church in particular is a fascinating entity because it very much grows out of this period of the Byzantine world. It is a uniquely Byzantine church that has fewer roots in the classical world, and importantly, it survives when the Byzantine Empire falls. And so Russian Orthodoxy does have a tendency to think of itself as being a central church of the Orthodox world. It is the only one that can sort of like point to its lineage all the way back to Constantinople and arguably beyond. But again, another conversation for another day, and not something we get to dwell on very much here, because the Russians do not produce a terribly robust body of literature at this particular point in history. But again, General Humanities 2, you'll almost certainly run into the Russians as well. For now, though, I want to focus on the Byzantine contribution to art. And the first thing I want to point out is that early Byzantine art, like arabesque in the Islamic world, tends to be thoroughly geometric. Like we've mentioned several times, like as we've sort of shifted from the classical art world, the likes of, you know, Virgil and the works of Augustus, and, you know, the works sort of like commissioned under his leadership, we've tended to see this sort of like idealization of human beings, these perfectly sculptured figures, and like these grand architectural monuments, these, you know, like mosaics that or other sort of like statuary that emphasizes, you know, human beauty, sometimes with a pagan twist, sometimes with a Christian twist. But as we've moved forward into the late Roman Empire and beyond, we've noticed that this gets considerably less naturalistic and considerably more symbolic, or like message-driven. Like the Arch of Constantine does not emphasize the purity of form the way that past like arches, past statuary tends to. As much as the Arch of Constantine steals directly from a bunch of the other arches at the time, if anything, it just highlights the contrast between the art styles of the pre-Constantinian world and the post-Constantinian world. But here in the, like, early Byzantine world, again, notice that both of these mosaics originate from the 5th century CE. So we're talking like before Justinian, but in the same century as Rome is struggling to stay on its feet and has been like sacked and conquered at least once. Notice that these tend to be much more geometric. Like, you can see representative images on this mosaic, but they are sort of dwarfed by all of these patterns. And again, this is very much a Christian habit. The Christians are very leery of representational art because, again, like the first couple of commandments in the 10 Commandments emphasize, you're not supposed to have any gods before gods, and you're not supposed to make any images of God. So as a result, like, when you have images, they tend to be pretty benign. They're animals or things. As much as we've seen some Christian art that is very representational, as much as Christians love to represent Christ in various patterns especially, there is pushback against that in the Byzantine world. And much of the most memorable and much of the oldest Byzantine art we have tends to be purely geometric, purely a matter of, like, eye-catching patterns, specifically because, on the one hand, it's not representational and therefore doesn't rub up against the 10 Commandments, but on the other hand, it's deliberately intended to sort of, like, distract you from, you know, staring at pretty ladies or thinking about sinfulness and thus getting yourself in trouble. This is meant to be a sort of help to Christians to keep their mind on things other than worldly pleasure. But this very much comes to a head in the 8th and 9th century with the iconomachy. And yeah, I know that the Khan Academy didn't use that word, but I don't care because it's awesome. Iconomachy literally means the icon battle, and it also sounds a lot like the Titanomachy, which is like the first great battle that the gods have against the Titans back in the ancient Greeks. So I'm sticking with this word because it's awesome. But the iconomachy largely is this battle, this sort of like ideological or theological conflict between the Christians on the one hand, who are very determined not to let there be any representational art, who want all art in the Byzantine world to be purely geometric, to replace all of those like icons and pictures with simple crosses. And, you know, even some of the mosaics in the Hagia Sophia are either covered up or destroyed or replaced in order to make good the iconoclasts, again, the anti-icon people, to make good their agenda. But you can also notice that there are plenty of people fighting back. What we sort of, like, after the fact call the iconoduels, although that's actually like a 17th century invention. Iconophile might also be appropriate here, but again, that's not what they called themselves. Again, the iconomachy is actually like the term that they use to describe this conflict, so even better to use the cooler term. But yeah, here in the Kludov Psalter, you can see that there's like a deliberate effort to justify icon making. Like, here is literally Christ being crucified and then, like, killing him by stabbing him in the side with the spear, the way that the Gospels tell us about. And here is this guy who is literally, like, making an icon, and the emphasis is, you know, you destroy the icon, you destroy the man. Like, you are guilty of crucifying Christ as much as you know, you are, as much, or as the soldiers who in fact did that, if you are the one who are destroying his images. Now, this is complicated and a theological debate that I don't necessarily have a horse in. Like, I'm a Protestant, so, you know, I don't really do icons, but unlike most Protestants, I'm also fairly tolerant of icon veneration. And for those of you who are listening and are Protestants or are confused about this topic, because it is sort of one of those, like, fiddly details that both the Catholics and the Orthodox Church have to face, but frequently doesn't wander over into American Christianity because American Christianity is so predominantly Protestant in organization. Icons are not meant to be worshipped themselves. The proper term here is veneration. When used properly, an icon is meant as a sort of focus for prayer. They're intentionally sort of unrealistic or naturalistic in most cases, but again, it's not a constant rule. Like, different artists, different cultures, different time periods have different priorities as far as this goes. But the idea is that by meditating on an icon of the Virgin Mary, or by meditating on an icon of Christ or one of the saints, you are directing your prayers to heaven with this focus in mind. This is how you organize your thoughts, how you sort of keep yourself from all the distractions that creep in when you try to focus on something with the level of, like, dedication and like, deliberation that is necessary when you pray to God. And consequently, like, they are meant to be benign. And traditionally, the creation of icons is itself a meditative practice. Like, it's usually something that is undergone by monks, or other holy people who are, you know, removed from the community in some other way. Again, like, this is one of the ways that monasteries make money and are so successful. But usually, like, there are handbooks for icon making, rigorous meditative manuals, where it's like every step of the process has to be accompanied by careful meditation, careful prayer, careful thought, and consequently, you're not just, like, knocking these things out, like, mass market manufacturing wise, as much as that might be the way that things are done now in some circles. So this was an attempt at piety. And the iconomachy, much as it is fun to say and occasionally weird to think about, is in fact a major schism between, you know, Christian thinkers trying to worship God appropriately. There are, yes, as always, power imbalances. Like, the iconoclasts are kind of led by the emperor. The iconoduels are often led by artists, but also the monks, because again, their interests are there. But in many cases, this is an attempt to sort of get at what does God want. They have a whole council about it. The council ultimately decides in favor of the iconoduels, but it also kind of doesn't matter because within a few centuries things start falling apart for the Byzantines anyway. But you should definitely know that it's a thing, because it's a cool thing with a cool word, but also just because it is very interesting to understand Christianity and sort of like how it goes about its business, even on an internal level. But we'll talk about icons more when we run into the Catholics, I'm sure. For now, I want to focus on the Crusades. Like, shortly after the iconomachy sort of runs its course, you'll notice that, like, the Byzantine Empire has now shrunk to a shadow of its former strength. You can see that the Sultanate here is absolutely getting real close to Constantinople, and the Byzantines therefore reach out to their fellow Christians for help. It's a little awkward timing-wise, seeing as we're doing this like about 50 years after the Great Schism, after like Rome and Constantinople really aren't talking or taking each other's calls anymore. But it doesn't change the fact that they are Christians, they are supposedly Christians together, and you know, at this point, the Catholics are looking for an excuse to sort of flex their papal power, so they absolutely agree to send the Byzantines a whole bunch of help. The Crusades are, as a rule, much more disorganized than modern people tend to make them out to be. Like, I know we all love our stories of knights in armor and the you know, King Arthur's Knights of the Round Table, many of which originate from this period as far as the storytelling is concerned, but are actually, like, in time, chronologically speaking, way earlier. Like, if King Arthur existed, it was like right after the fall of Rome or during the fall of Rome. Like, we are very much in the future at this point. But I gotta stress, like, this is not an organized campaign. The First Crusade is just a mess. Like, the Pope largely gets people to sign up for it by telling them that they'll automatically go to heaven if they join up, and this actually attracts a ton of criminals to the cause. Like, they show up expecting, like, a no-holds-barred pass to heaven, despite the fact that they've murdered a bunch of people or sold their skills as a mercenary. Excuse me for that, by the way. They've sold their skills as a mercenary or done something equally awful, and consequently, like, this is the only way that they have to potentially, like, re-enter the Christian community. So they sign up, and now you've got a whole bunch of, like, sketchy dudes wandering off through the, you know, European countryside, often looting and pillaging as they go. Like, there's definitely a bunch of anti-Semitism that gets executed at this point, too, as they, like, run through Jewish communities and, like, sack them and take all their things. In Europe, by the way, like, before they've managed to get even to the Byzantine Empire. But they do show up. They do manage to conquer a decent amount of territory, these Crusader states that you can see here. We'll talk about it more from the medieval Christian perspective when we get to the Crusades in our next discussion. For now, notice that we do have a couple of Crusader states that crop up after the First Crusade and that kind of stick around for a while. But these are largely, like, in many cases, tolerated by the Muslim world. Like, we don't care. It's not important enough to do something about it, especially because the Muslims have other stuff going on, usually internecine fighting. At this point, the Fatimid Empire is kind of, like, running the show, and the Abbasids are sort of, like, under control of the Buyids, as we'll talk about. All of which means that they don't have enough time or energy or interest in dealing with all of these upstart crusaders, who are actually pretty decent neighbors in many cases. Like, they're definitely not invading anyone, so they're great buffer states, and, you know, it keeps the Byzantines from being able to, like, invade the, various areas of the Muslim world without any warning. But eventually, this does come to the notion of somebody who can do something about it. Specifically, when Saladin, like the great leader of the Muslim world in the Third Crusade, comes to power, he absolutely, like, recaptures Jerusalem, which is, in fact, a pain in the Muslim side. Like, I cannot emphasize that one enough. Jerusalem is, like, the third most holy city in the Muslim world, after Mecca and Medina. Arguably, like, on par with Medina, though, again, I am not Muslim, and I don't know necessarily what I'm talking about here. Jerusalem is a big deal. The Dome on the Rock is a big deal. The fact that the Crusaders control it is a big deal. So when Saladin, who is a very competent general and a very competent statesman and a very competent politician, manages to conquer Jerusalem, this, like, very much gets the dander up of both the Byzantines and the Catholic Christians, which is why they launched their Third Crusade in 1189 to sort of recapture Jerusalem. But they fail miserably. Like, it's almost hilarious how badly they fail in the Third Crusade when you look at it from, like, the top down. The Fourth Crusade is likewise meant to sort of recapture Jerusalem, but at this point the Pope isn't into it anymore, and the whole thing backfires horribly. The Crusaders show up in Constantinople hoping to be supplied, hoping to, you know, pass through the city on their way to the Crusader states on their way to Jerusalem. And Constantinople sees that these guys are not to be trusted, will not let them in the city, and the Christians besiege the Christians. Like, the Fourth Crusade kind of very much ends when Christians sent by the Pope sack the city of Constantinople, like the Byzantine Empire's capital, and basically loot the place. This doesn't spell the end of Constantinople. Again, it's 1204. Like, the Byzantine Empire is going to limp on for a while yet. But this is a major setback, a major blow to its power, and it does very much set up the fall of Constantinople in the 15th century. At this point, the Ottoman Empire has been gradually expanding and sort of, like, out of what the territory that used to be traditionally Byzantine at that. Growing and growing in size until they've surrounded Constantinople on all sides, at which point in 1452, I believe, they sack the city, they conquer it for themselves, and it becomes the center of the Ottoman Empire, which will be a big deal in its own right. Like, again, its height is in the 17th century, which is well out of our scope for this class. They are very much growing into a power by the end of the 15th century, as our scope sort of wraps up. But they will continue to be a power. They will continue to threaten especially Europe, and they will continue to conquer more and more of the Muslim world in particular, and become sort of the Muslim power of this part of the world. But again, that's well after our scope. Like, again, I don't want to, like, jump the gun and immediately move to the Ottomans when they really are sort of like the end of our story in another respect. So that's the story of the Byzantines, start to finish. From its very noble Roman beginnings, its very, promising start with Justinian and the reconquest of so much of the Roman Empire, all the way to its conquering by the Ottoman Empire in the 15th century, whether or not that's within our scope. But the other story that we obviously have to talk about here is the Muslim side of the story. Again, if anything, the Islamic world is richer, more powerful, thrives, and grows much more than the Byzantines do during this period. But in order to talk about the Islamic world and the Islamic conquest, you've got to start your conversation with the Quran. Like, the Muslim world, much unlike the Byzantine world, is very much theocratic first. Like, there was a sort of uneasy peace between the emperor and the patriarch of Constantinople. There is no conflict whatever between the religious figures in the Muslim world and the secular figures, largely because they are one and the same at their origin. According to Muslim tradition, Muhammad started receiving visions from God in the 6th century CE, and started recording them in the book that we now call the Quran. Like, he wrote them down. Later scholars would sort of consolidate them into the Quran. But within 50 years of Muhammad's life, I should stress, like, as far as from pen to institution, there is no faster turnaround among the Abrahamic religions. Like, we have a lot of questions about when the Old Testament was composed and, how old these texts actually are. There are some substantial questions about the New Testament and when it was composed and whether or not the people who claim to write it actually wrote it. But all of those are resolved within, like, 150 years of Christ's birth. For the Quran, we're talking about a 50-year turnaround. Like, Muhammad claims to start having visions around the 6th century, and by the beginning of the 7th century, like, the Quran is codified. He starts having visions around the beginning of the 7th century, and by the end of the 7th century, the Quran is codified. Like, by 650, there are scholars who have already, like, declared this is the definitive Quran, and this remains the Quran to this day. So there's not a whole lot of discussion about provenance or authorship or any of that. Muhammad wrote it, that's the end. But even to say that Muhammad wrote it is misleading, and I am already stepping on myself and apologizing to all the Muslims in my audience. Muhammad didn't write it. He got it from the angel Gabriel. And this is a big deal, too. Like, pay attention to this, because it's going to have major repercussions down the road. Gabriel dictated the Quran to Muhammad in the Muslim tradition. And this is, again, very unlike both the Old Testament and the New Testament in Christian and Jewish circles. The Old Testament is supposedly written by Moses, but sort of retroactively everybody understands that it was inspired by God. God breathed, whatever that means. But this is rarely assumed to mean that God, like, literally gave him word for word what appears in Exodus, or, what appears in Judges or Joshua, or what appears in the New Testament. The assumption in Christian circles is that, like, Christians or Jews are adapting the message as they see from God. They're taking a revelation that was not language-oriented or literal, and turning it into their best approximation of what was meant there. Like, they're turning it into language, which is part of the reason why I, have all these questions about hermeneutics. Here, there are no hermeneutic questions. What you see is what you get. And for that reason, when you talk about the Quran, you cannot say that, like, I read the Quran if you're reading it in English. You have to say that you read a translation of the Quran. The Quran isn't just, like, the book. it isn't just the meaning of the book, and it isn't just some, approximation of the words of the book. It is literally the words in Arabic that appear in your Arabic versions of the Quran. The recitation is the Quran in a very real sense. It is more alive than the words on the page in the Bible in that sense. And it is kind of rigorously protected in this way. And I gotta stress this. Like, again, Christians and Jews both tend to be pretty loosey-goosey about their theology in a lot of respects. Christians tend to be pretty tolerant of theological deviation, of different interpretations of people who disagree with them. And yes, I know that I am saying that despite talking about all of these Christian heresies where, like, different Christian communities were killing each other. Yeah, that's tolerant by Muslim standards. Again, like the Jews, as we've talked about, in the Talmud and elsewhere, there's emphasis that, like, yes, there are multiple interpretations, and for that matter, there are interpretations well beyond the scope of the text that are widely accepted by Jewish communities. In Islam, this is a very different animal. There are different interpretations, yes, and some of those interpretations are rigorously held to for one reason or another. The entire Hadith is largely built around the Quran and is, again, as John Green emphasized in the Crash Course video on the subject, there are some Hadith that are more trustworthy than others. Some Muslims hold many Hadith in higher esteem than they hold some of the other Hadith. It's complicated, and I don't presume to know what I'm talking about when I'm getting into it. But what I want to stress is, where the Quran or where the Bible is very subject to interpretation, Muslims are very rigorously careful about their interpretation of the Quran. There are stronger rules here that are tolerated elsewhere. And this is why Muslims tend to be very protective of the way that Muhammad is portrayed, the way that God is portrayed. And again, I'm going to use the word God here because, again, the Arabic word means God. Allah is usually just a way of, like, Christians and Jews sort of making a difference where there isn't one between, Muslims and Christians, often for xenophobic and Islamophobic reasons. So worshiping God, identifying God as sacred, preserving God's sacredness, these are the priorities of the Muslim world. Again, the Muslim creed here is there is only one God, and that God is God. This is the cry, the, command. It cannot be, controverted or disagreed with. For Christians to have conversations about a Trinity is straight up blasphemy for Muslims, as much as they are tolerant of Christian teaching and Christian beliefs and theology. Now, that said, the story of the Quran and the story of Muhammad is very bound up with its history. Like, the Quran itself is a very different animal from the Bible in its subject matter as well. Like, the Bible vacillates between, like, here are some history passages, here are some law passages, here are some passages that are, like, great teachings or wisdom. Even the New Testament, it's like, here are some letters, and here is some history, here is, this person's letters, and so on and so forth. But the actual material of the Quran is considerably less striated in this way, for lack of a better way of putting it. Like, these are very much just writings from Gabriel again, and they frequently include a bunch of all of this. Like, you'll find surahs in the Quran, especially in the early Quran where the longer surahs exist. You'll find, like, surahs that incorporate all of these things. Some history, some theology, some politics, some wisdom, some commandments. Like, it's much less easy to parse from where I'm sitting, again, as an outsider to the faith. And as much as I'm trying to learn the Quran, I just do not have the familiarity with it that I do with the Bible, so I will definitely struggle as I'm trying to, like, both interpret and read and sort of, like, come up with passages that are good excerpts for this class. But I've got to stress, again, much of the Quran was written during Muhammad's life, and especially during Muhammad's political career. Like, as he is, in fact, being exiled from Mecca and sort of, like, cast off to Medina in the Hijra, like it very much takes place as he's like reconquering Mecca, as you know he's wandering through the desert, getting allies, you know, waging war. Many of the surahs of the Quran are in fact written on specific occasions before great battles, or you know, like with conquests or setbacks in mind as they were written. And consequently, like, trying to pick out one specific passage that is sort of like definitive. This is the Quranic statement on peace or warfare. This is the Quranic statement on the treatment of Jews or Christians. It's complicated. It's messy, and I don't claim to have a handle on it. But I am learning to get a handle on it. And again, like, what I want to stress here, again, separate from Christian tradition and very much in contradistinction to Christian tradition, is that where Christianity was an underground religion, where Judaism was a religion frequently persecuted and that sort of developed its own national identity later, again, during the monarchy, here in Islam, we have a state and nation rising up right next to one another. This has never been a problem for the Muslims. Muhammad was their spiritual leader. Muhammad was their political leader. And as soon as Muhammad dies and Abu Bakr takes over, Abu Bakr claims political, secular authority without claiming any spiritual authority. And this is the tradition that will follow. Like, we're looking at the 5 Rashidun, which are largely understood to be like the 5 great early caliphs. Starting with Muhammad himself here in the center. Notice that his face is whited out. This is typical of portrayals of Muhammad. You're not allowed to represent him. Again, the Muslims take the proscription against graven images in the Bible very, very seriously. And again, I gotta stress, like, Muslims accept like 80% of the Bible. They see the Old Testament and New Testament as being sort of foundational to Islamic faith and Muslim teaching. But they usually get their understanding of the Bible filtered through the Quran. We talked last time about how, like, Islam sees Ishmael as being the son of Abraham, who receives the blessing of God and receives all of the promises of Abraham. This is an interpretation given to us by the Quran, but the Quran assumes familiarity with both Judaism and Christianity and sees truth in both teachings, even if not the final truth. That's the key. Muhammad is the final prophet of God, and the Quran is the final prophecy of God, the last word to presumably correct all of the incorrect words that have gone before. And notice that again, since this was dictated rather than inspired, since this is word for word God's message, you can't ask questions about whether we got it right or wrong. It is what it is. So Abu Bakr takes over command of the Islamic forces in 632 and proceeds on his own sort of conquests. Again, by the end of Abu Bakr's reign, most of the Arabian Peninsula is under Muslim control. But I gotta stress that even here, we're already running into some potential factional difficulties here in Islam. Largely because a lot of people think that, well, the Shia in particular think that Ali, who was a relative of Muhammad and also his son-in-law, he married Fatima, Muhammad's daughter. A lot of Muslims believe that Ali should have inherited leadership from Muhammad directly. So as much as Abu Bakr is widely considered, especially by Sunni Muslims, to be a good leader and a good ruler for Islam, this is often considered a misstep. And there is being sown the seeds of discontent even here right after Muhammad's death. After Abu Bakr, Umar, who is portrayed here at the left bottom, he takes over the control of the Muslim world and continues to expand the Muslim reach, like starting to poke into other territory, especially into Byzantine territory, into the Sassanid Persian territory. And then finally, Uthman over here manages to make some major campaigns which further extend the empire before Ali does in fact take over, but only after Uthman is assassinated under suspicious circumstances, which leads Ali himself to be assassinated under pretty dodgy circumstances. all this to suggest that there is major political infighting within like 30 years of Muhammad's death. There is violence sort of inherent in the caliphate system in some ways. It's troubling, is kind of what it comes down to. Now, some of this has major repercussions down the road. Again, there are more Sunni Muslims than Shia Muslims by a wide margin worldwide. And the Sunni Muslim tradition sees Abu Bakr as the rightful heir to Muhammad, sees Uthman and Umar as both being legitimate successors to the caliphate, whereas the Shia Muslims, which there are a dramatic minority of Shia Muslims, but importantly they're primarily concentrated in the Middle East, especially in Iran and Iraq, these Shia Muslims contest that Ali should have been the leader from the beginning, like it never should have passed to Abu Bakr, and that Ali is the rightful heir because he is, you know, a blood relative of Muhammad, because he does continue the succession directly. And Shia Muslims insist that the leadership should have been passed on by blood, which is complicated. As far as I can tell, and again, like my knowledge here is pretty limited, my studies here are pretty limited, but it seems that in the days of, again, Abu Bakr, Umar and Uthman, the Arabs were actually really suspicious of the idea of, like, blood succession as the justification for leadership. My understanding is that when, in fact, like, the Umayyad caliphate rose up and started like passing on the caliphate to like blood successors, father to son and so on and so forth, like this was actually really upsetting to a lot of the Arabs who in Bedouin society this was not how things were done. So my understanding is that this is sort of like a contemporary or more contemporary sort of like reassessment, but again, Islam is messy, Islam is complicated. Not to say that Christianity or Judaism isn't. Again, there's plenty of schisms, plenty of violence there. I'm not trying to like paint Islam as being an especially violent religion or anything. I'm just saying what I'm saying because I'm looking at the history and, you know, seeing it the way that I see it. This is important to understand in order to understand Islam. And if you are, you know, immersed in the Islamic world, this whole conversation, this whole debate and discussion kind of comes as second nature. But to Sunni Muslims, it's kind of not an issue. Or at least it's not supposed to be. Like, these were the faithful, these were good leaders, their deaths were tragic, not some sort of political scandal, and consequently, like, Islam continues to spread and persist, and all is well here in the Islamic world. It is the Shia who argue that it is not well, that this is in some way, you know, erroneous or wrong. They're in some respect holding a long grudge over a long period of time. But both claim that the other distorts the Quran, that they have in some way subverted the message. For the Sunni, the Shia have adopted the wrong hadith, have, you know, prioritized the legacy and lineage of Muhammad over the teachings of the Quran. For the Shia, the Quranic teachings that the Sunni have embraced and adopted are incorrect and, you know, distorted because of their adherence to these sort of false caliphs and false tradition. I definitely can't weigh in on this. Like, again, historically speaking, there is a rift here that I do not fully appreciate the theological dimensions of, but know this because it will inform the Islamic world both throughout the medieval world and today. For now, we're going to keep following the succession. Again, like under the various Muslim leaders, especially the Rashidun, Islam spreads dramatically, like all the way to Tripoli over here in Libya. It starts to like edge into the territory of the Byzantine Empire and into the Persian Empire. Again, notice that like by 651, well under the reigns of the Rashidun, especially under Umar and Uthman, who were very expansionist, much of the Muslim conquest happens in rapid fire succession. Like, Medina is the first city to be claimed by Muhammad. Again, this is, like, the first city that welcomes him in and converts to Islam. And this is, like, 622, when, like, Muhammad enters Medina, is widely considered the beginning of the Muslim time frame. Like, they do not consider it year 622. They consider that year 1. And everything before that is, like, relatively unimportant, much the same way that the Christians consider Jesus's birth to be year one, and so on and so forth. But by the time that like Abu Bakr and Ali have perished, all of this territory has been taken over. Like, the Byzantine Empire has shrunk to virtually half its original size. Like, they haven't taken their way all the way to Spain. That will happen under the Umayyad Caliphate. But they have managed to sort of build an empire basically within 30 years, which is really impressive. And I gotta stress that, like I said before, a lot of this isn't necessarily by conquest. The Quran is actually pretty clear. You can't coerce people into believing in the Muslim faith. But it's pretty okay with you taking over territory for one reason or another, for political reasons or secular reasons, or, you know, issues related to the like spread of the faith or the spread of the power of the believers. So there are traditions where, you know, supposedly this was a violent conquest, that the Muslims conquered by the sword. But there are plenty of stories out there that suggest that some of the most major conquests, especially like Alexandria here in Egypt, they were happy to get out from under Byzantine control. Like, the Muslims showed up at the door and they said, hey, if you spare us, you can have the city. Like, we don't want it anymore. So they did. And again, like, there are frequently stories about how Abu Bakr destroyed the Library of Alexandria, or alternatively that, like, one of the other leaders, like Umar or Uthman, is responsible for the burning of the Library of Alexandria. And there's just no evidence that this is the case. Like, all of those stories are hearsay. It seems that actually they preserved the Library of Alexandria. In fact, took a lot of their texts and read them, because the Muslims are actually really interested in philosophy and scholarship and learning. And, you know, in many cases, they'd learned Greek and started to propagate these texts all throughout the Muslim world. So, yeah, as much as this is usually framed as violent, it really isn't as violent as it seems. A lot of the world very much accepted Islam pretty readily. Remember, it's a pretty dark place. The Roman Empire has fallen. The organization offered by the Roman Empire has fallen. At this point, the Persian Empire has been really struggling to, you know, fight against the Byzantines, and they are ripe for the pickings now that the Arabs are starting to spread. Likewise, the Byzantine Empire has been gutted by their fights with the Persian Empire, and they are ripe for the conquest as well. The trouble is, this becomes a habit. After the Rashidun, the Umayyad Caliphate really begins with the Caliph Muawiyah. I think I'm probably butchering that pronunciation, but I am trying. He sets up a sort of like capital of the new Muslim world, not in Mecca or Medina, but in Damascus, and very much sort of starts the Arab era of rule of the Muslim world. And importantly, like, the trouble is, because of all of this conquest, because of all of this fighting, and because the Bedouins just are sort of antsy folk, I realize that I'm getting, like, really, really pejorative here. I have frequently heard it said that the Bedouin communities were tough to keep in line during this period, that they were difficult to govern, and when left for long periods of time without anything to do, they would frequently fight amongst themselves or start fighting amongst other Muslim people, possibly even to the point of, like, besieging or taking over cities. The Umayyad Empire, or the Umayyad Caliphate, sort of, like, harnessed this energy by sending many of these Bedouin forces and many of these, you know, like, especially violent military contingents to take over more and more territory, thus guaranteeing even more spread of the Muslim world under the Umayyad Caliphate. And the Umayyads spread all the way to the Indus River. Again, like, they control basically the entire empire of Alexander the Great, as well as this entire southern half of the Roman Empire. They expand all across North Africa, incorporating the Berbers into the Muslim world, as well as conquering Spain, like crossing the Strait of Gibraltar and working their way all the way up towards France. At which point, you'll notice, like, the Islamic world has spread so far that it now basically surrounds the Christian world, the Catholic world in Western Europe, as well as the Byzantine world in Eastern Europe, as well as incorporating the entire Persian Empire, the entire Arabian Peninsula, all of Egypt as we've studied it, and in fact we're, like, rubbing up against China in the northeast, the Indian world in the southeast, you know, like, Western African civilization in the far west, as well as the Christian civilization in the north and the northwest. So the Arab world is huge. It is sprawling. The trick is, it's only going to be this organized under the Umayyads, and they can't keep it for very long. Again, like, the Arab world is inclined to factionalism, inclined to sort of, like, self-destruction in some sense. Again, I hate to put it this way, but, like, there is not the level of organization here that you will see with the Roman Empire. There is no interest in building some sort of widespread infrastructure that incorporates the entire empire. In some respect, they get that anyway, but kind of as a matter of habit rather than as a matter of, like, deliberate intention. Where the Romans have a very strict policy of conquering territory, turning it into provinces, and then taxing those provinces. For the Umayyads, it really is just about conquest, and then things spread so far that they are vulnerable to factionalization from within. At which point, all of those people who are upset with the fact that this has become about secular power, has become about conquest, and has sort of, like, forgotten the origins of, like, the Islamic faith itself, start fighting back against the Umayyads. Which brings us to the Abbasid revolt and the Abbasid sort of coup of the Umayyad Empire. The Abbasids take over in 750, relocate the capital from Damascus to Baghdad, and essentially reframe the way that the empire is formed. Importantly, the Abbasids, if the Damascus Umayyad Caliphate is very much the Arab rule of the Islamic world, the Abbasids are very much the Persian rule of the Islamic world. Remember, they conquer the Persian Empire, but as much as, like, the Persians sort of, in some respect, like, kind of break off in some ways during this period, the Persian contingent within Islam becomes the dominant voice, relocates the capital of the Islamic world to Baghdad, a typical Persian stronghold, and in many cases alienates many of the other, like, Islamic contingents or forces across this giant world that they've built. So notice that this is the Abbasid Caliphate in the 9th century. The Abbasids, as a rule, like, they take over, but pretty quickly they realize that they don't want to govern a massive empire. They want to be the center of secular power for the faithful. They want to, practice Persian lifestyles and cultural values, but they're not interested in, like, this massive military campaign spreading the globe. So gradually they grant independence of one kind or another to different Muslim organizations. Like, these people are still going to believe in Islam, but they're not going to be necessarily beholden to the Abbasid Caliphate. This independence works for them. Like, these are allies, they can trade with them, they just don't rule them the way that they were ruled under the Umayyads, and that seems to be working out well for everyone. But at the same time, like, a contingent of Umayyad loyalists out in Spain basically declare their own Umayyad Caliphate and decide that they're going to, like, keep the fires burning for the Umayyads, and who cares about the Abbasids because they're too far away to do anything about it anyway. Now, under the Abbasids, the empire does flourish. Like, this is very much the era of Islam's golden age, which we'll talk about in some detail in a moment. But I want to stress, like, it is a very different perspective, a very different attitude that the Muslim world under the Abbasids have as opposed to the Umayyads. And under this sort of loose governorship, there is more room for more factional trouble. Specifically, like, the Shiites, the Shia Muslims who have been, gradually more and more unsettled by first the Arab focus on wealth under the Umayyads, and then the Persian sort of dissociation from Arab values and sort of, like, strict Quranic interpretation on the other hand, start to actively revolt against the Abbasids. And as the Abbasids are also dealing with some internal conflicts, specifically these Buyids who are sort of, like, taking over the government and sort of turning the Abbasids to their own purposes, in the late 10th and 11th centuries, this new Shia contingent, the Fatimids, again named Fatimid after Fatima, the daughter of Muhammad, basically like start their own caliphate here in Egypt, with the capital in Cairo, and proceed to spread throughout, especially Western Africa and the eastern or the western half of the Arabic Peninsula, which you'll note it gets pretty dang close to Mecca and Medina, meaning that the Fatimid Caliphate is going to be the dominant voice in Islam for like a good 100 years or so. But again, I gotta stress, like, I'm only scratching the surface here. The scholarship surrounding the development of the Islamic world is pretty limited in English in my experience, and I'm trying to get more, but most of my sources are a little dated, and there's not a whole lot of, like, impetus for me to do this, because, again, as much as I want to teach it in my classes, and as much as I think it's important, it's not necessarily the priority of the people who are writing the curricula around here. So, nothing against Montclair, nothing against any of the schools where I teach, but I am very much like following my own sort of like interests on this one. And I gotta stress, like, again, like I've been saying throughout, there's a lot that I'm unqualified to talk about here that I'm talking about anyway, just because I find it interesting and I think that it should be taught more widely. But I also very much get the sense, as an independent scholar on this one, that I am very much not welcome in these conversations. I know that I'm an outsider in some respect, and I mean that in multiple senses. Like, I realize that in the Western world, we usually don't talk about the Islamic world as a part of our heritage or a part of our culture. And on the one hand, that's because of Islamophobia. On the other hand, it's because of the bias and Eurocentrism that we talked about earlier. Both of which I feel are things that we should be correcting. But on the other hand, like, my understanding is that from the perspective of the Islamic world, they're not looking for representation, necessarily. Like, as much as I'm really interested in Islamic history, Islamic culture, Islamic literature, Islamic philosophy, as a rule, much of what we're talking about here, the various sort of, like, internecine struggles of the various Islamic factions, and medieval Islamic history in general, isn't a huge priority for the Muslim scholarly world. Or if it is, it's not something that's getting communicated in English. Like, there is a dearth of literature on the subject, but every time that I start running into questions about, okay, I want to study Ibn Sina more, or I want to study the Arabian Nights more, I usually run into, like, the scholarship just doesn't exist. It's not a priority for the contemporary Muslim world for one reason or another. So I am kind of an outsider on both respects. I am very much sort of like digging into something that the Western world thinks is none of my business, because it's not something that is like personally relevant to me. I'm not Muslim. I was not, born into the Muslim world. I don't have Arabic heritage. Like, I'm a Polish dude, which means that, like, there were probably Muslims in my neck of the woods at one point in my history, but it's not something I can identify from, like, looking up my genealogical heritage. So I'm kind of not welcome on that front. But from the Muslim perspective, like, they're not interested in me as a convert. I'm not interested in the right stuff. Like, since I am not interested in converting to Islam, the doors are pretty well closed to me, it seems. And since I don't know Arabic, like, I can't very well just, like, dig this stuff up. Again, this is just my impression. Everything that I've heard, every Muslim I've talked to has been really interested and open to, my inquiries about Islam in particular. But anytime I start talking about the history, anytime I start talking about the literature, anytime I start bringing up the poetry, it's like the conversation turns. Either they don't know about it, or it's awkward to talk about, or it's more complicated than I'm necessarily appreciating. So I just want to communicate that here. Again, I am not trying to put a pejorative spin on the Muslim world. I find it fascinating, and I'm trying to study it and understand it from as objective a stance as I can, with knowing full well that I can talk much more eloquently about Christianity just because I've been dwelling there for so long. And I aspire to understand the Islamic world and Islamic culture and the Islamic faith to some degree with the, same level of depth. But again, like, where Christians are always willing to offer all of the information that they have at their disposal in the hope of converting me to their particular worldview, I'm not getting that from the Islamic world, either because of the language barrier, or because of the scholastic barrier, or because of the Islamophobia barrier. Like, there are a lot of issues with trying to research the history and culture of medieval Islam if you are not already plugged into the history and culture of medieval Islam. So let that just be out there. My information is insufficient. If you know more than I do, if you're catching me at all of my errors, if you think I'm being radically disrespectful, please tell me and, like, email me and, you know, send me information that would help me to understand the situation better. Because, like I said, I'm having a lot of difficulty finding scholastic objectivity here. It is either very Muslim, like, inside baseball, where, you know, it's very much geared towards the theological and religious understanding, often from a radically Sunni or Shia perspective, at least as I'm digging around online. And on the flip side, again, like, it seems like English-speaking scholars just really aren't that interested in this discussion. So any resources you know of, any books that you might recommend, I would be happy to read, because I'm floundering and trying to do better here. But again, the defense that I offer when I do a video like this is that I would rather say my limited, broken, incomplete piece than give you nothing. Like, I'd rather say, you know, here is 45 minutes of me talking about the Muslim world from a perspective that I don't fully understand, than to spend 0 minutes on it and be like, and Islam was also a thing, moving on. So yeah, with that in mind, let's talk about Islamic culture a bit. And again, here I gotta stress, I am going to be very much on my own, and I'm not following necessarily any, like, research besides what I've sort of bumped into along the way, much of which is very slapdash or very rough. So first off, Islamic poetry is huge. Like, I gotta tell you, Arabic poetry is kind of, like, really important to Islamic culture, to the culture of the Islamic world. Because, again, since God presented the final prophecy to Muhammad in Arabic, Muslim scholars understand throughout the medieval world and beyond that Arabic is the sacred language. It is like the language chosen by God. It is the most beautiful language because it was the one chosen by God. And consequently, Arabic poetry is venerated among the Islamic world. Like, much of that poetry is dedicated to celebration of the Quran, celebration of the religion, of Muhammad and of the Rashidun and of the various successors, as well as just of God and of the faith in general. But my understanding is that Islamic poetry actually extends to some pretty surprising topics. This guy here in particular, Abu Nuwas, the 8th century Arabic poet, so, you know, figure he's got to be under either the Umayyads or the early Abbasids or both, apparently he wrote quite a few poems on the subject of how awesome wine is, which is itself kind of scandalous because the Quran has some pretty decent prescriptions on wine, and throughout much of the medieval Islamic world, wine was, if not forbidden to drink, then at least, like, frowned upon in certain ways, as well as some ghazal or love poems on the subject of pederasty. Like, he gets really, really affectionate with some of his wine boys, which again is not something that the contemporary Islamic world is very keen to embrace. The views on homosexuality are very dim in the Islamic world, though apparently more tolerated at certain points during medieval Islamic history. It's complicated. Abu Nuwas is held up as one of the great Islamic poets. His poetry is often regarded as some of the most beautiful, especially before, like, the golden age of the 10th and 11th centuries. But I find him to be fascinating because he does sort of kick off this very Islamic notion of love poetry, which will become very influential, especially in the Western medieval world, as the Spanish Umayyads sort of, like, start to interact with and exchange literary works with the medieval troubadours. Which brings us to Ibn Hazm. Ibn Hazm wrote this very famous Islamic work called the Dove's Neck Ring, also in Arabic, if I'm not mistaken, and it's sort of like a hybrid of philosophical prose with love poems. It was absolutely beloved in Europe throughout the 12th and 13th centuries and became very much sort of the foundation for the courtly love movement, I suspect. Again, the scholarship is limited here, and there are a fair number of medieval scholars who would push back on that one. But everything that I'm seeing is that this is like a one-for-one, slam-dunk, obvious connection. and anyone who is not paying attention to it is sort of out of their minds here. Like, I will not go on a limb for, I think my understanding of Islamic poetry is great, but I will go out on a limb for my understanding of Islamic poetry's influence on medieval courtly love poetry is pretty solid here. So Ibn Hazm is very well regarded as well in both Islamic and medieval culture from what I understand, although again, talking about secular subjects and especially secular love is dubious, especially among a lot of contemporary Muslims, especially in the very conservative and especially Shia like associated territory. Now, Islamic literature is a different animal. Again, Islamic poetry is revered and regarded because of the beauty of the Arabic language as a sort of offshoot of the divine language that God gave to Muhammad. But prose is another matter. The Muslims have a pretty dim view of fiction in the same way that they have a pretty dim view of like representational art representing either Muhammad or God or any of the sort of like religious icons in Muslim practice. Again, like that picture I gave you of the Rashidun, that little miniature there, that was a 16th century miniature. You were hard pressed to find representational art representing any of the Rashidun anywhere in Muslim scholarship in the medieval world, mostly because, again, like, if there was a period where they were cracking down on this, they typically destroyed anything that might have been there, although it's really hard to get at whether it just didn't exist ever or was destroyed by a later caliphate. Again, the records here are very sketchy. The one like work of Islamic literature that everyone here in the West is super familiar with is the Arabian Nights, but as with the poetry of Abu Nuwas, this is not respected in the Islamic world. Like, this is one of the places that I've tried to dig the deepest because I find the Arabian Nights absolutely fascinating from both a mythological standpoint, a storytelling standpoint, as well as, like, as I grow more and more interested in Islamic culture and more is interested in Islamic philosophy and history. But yeah, there's nothing on the Arabian Nights in the Islamic world. This is considered a vulgar, subpar work using like a grotesque, common version of Arabic, which is not worth studying, is not worth the scholarship. And consequently, like, this is sort of emblematic of the relationship I have with Islam. Like, I recognize the fact that by doing this scholarship, I am kind of unwelcome, the same way that Richard Burton was unwelcome and sort of co-opting Islamic works of literature like the Arabian Nights for sale in England and making a whole bunch of money off of it while he was doing it. Especially because at least part of Burton's point was he was going to use all those sexy scenes to sell to, like, uptight Victorians who otherwise didn't have any, you know, exterior mode of sexual expression. Like, I get the fact that I run the risk of cultural or appropriation and of, like, taking this thing from a culture where it is, in fact, like, part of their culture and turning it into something of my own. But on the other hand, like, it's something that has been repudiated by its culture of origin. Like, the Muslims don't want this. So on the one hand, I feel like, well, I should respect their wishes. I should definitely note anytime that I start talking about the Arabian Nights and Muslim fiction that, like, this is not something that the Muslims study. This is not an area of serious Muslim scholarship, and in some respect, this is beneath the notice of Muslim scholars. But on the other hand, I feel pretty comfortable saying, hey, I like it, I find it fascinating, and I think it's worth studying. Specifically because it is unique among mythological traditions, just because Islam engaged with so much of the rest of the world. Like, the Arabian Nights are sort of a proto, you know, romantic era, like, folklore study, except that where, like, the Brothers Grimm or Charles Perrault is sort of, like, trying to build these collections of like, myths and folk tales in their own culture, or like Gogol is doing in Russia. The Arabian Nights have sort of gradually become this composite text over 1,000 years in some cases, like early editions of, you know, proto-Arabian Nights stories and story collections exist as early as like 11th century and 12th century manuscripts. But it's not just Islam. Like, again, because the Muslim world was so interconnected with the world of China or the world of India or the African world or, even the Byzantines to some degree, all of these cultures get nods in the Arabian Nights. This is absolutely not just a fascinating work of storytelling, but a fascinating look at a cosmopolitan world that existed before anyone thought that was a thing. Most of these cultures tend to be pretty reticent to engage with outsiders. Like, throughout the ancient world, you've got this Greek and Roman sort of fear or paranoia about outside cultures, whereas as much as Islam becomes sort of closed, becomes this sort of conservative institution in its later years, here it gives us a vision of a world where, no, there were interconnections all over the place. There was religious tolerance, and there were cultural tolerances that, boggle the mind for this culture and not even empire, but, series of interlapping empires that just spanned from one coast to the next. And it's just fascinating, because it really does give us an idea of how interconnected that Islamic world is. And as much as, again, you can say as much as you want about whether or not the cultural relics of the Islamic world are welcome or intolerant or abandoned by the Islamic world today. One of the things that history cannot contravene is just how huge the Islamic trade network actually was. It spread all throughout sub-Saharan Africa, including to Timbuktu and the Malian Empire, which we'll be talking about in a little bit. There were frequently Islamic traders working, especially in, the later part of the medieval era, throughout the European world. The reason why the Renaissance was able to happen was because the Venetian traders were making so much money trading with, Islamic traders who were themselves trading with not just the entire Islamic empire, but throughout Africa, throughout India, throughout China, and, going over the Silk Road. And this doesn't even necessarily do justice to it. My understanding is that the Vikings were trading actively with the Muslims as well, and we can find, 9th and 10th century Viking relics and artifacts throughout the Islamic world. The Islamic trade network was the backbone of Islamic prosperity and what basically contributed to Islam's golden age. As much as we see Islam as this very tightly connected group of believers with a very strict understanding of their own text, and I don't want to deny or repudiate that, because of the religious tolerance built into so many of the texts and so many of the caliphates, there was this remarkable opportunity to see outsider perspectives and to appreciate outsider art. So many of the Muslim caliphs and shahs and great leaders of the era throughout the medieval world had huge storehouses full of the wisdom and literature and study and, the treasures of nations unimaginably far away. This was an empire poised at the center of the Eurasian and African worlds. And it took advantage of its position. As much as we see the Roman Empire as the empire that conquered the world, they were never this connected with the rest of the world at large. It's shocking how much the Islamic world had its connections with the rest of, the other nations that were around at this point and endured with these relatively peaceable connections. This is why I want to know more about it. This is why I want to study it more, because for us to have literally spent our entire high school and elementary careers studying history and especially studying American history, and then for me to get into my master's and realize that this was a thing, that this was what the world looked like back in the 11th century and 12th century, when other scholars are talking about the Dark Ages or are getting really caught up with their discussions of the Pope. Screw that noise. This is fascinating. How can we not be interested in this stuff? How can we not look at this and see this as foundational to the modern world of trade and culture and, interconnected society as any part of the medieval era? But again, I digress. But what I want to stress is, because of this trade system, because of this connection to the rest of the world, Islam started building its own scientific community as well. very much starting with the philosophers that we see here, like Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd, and Al-Ghazali are three of like the monumental figures of Muslim philosophy, all sort of writing and working during that period between the 10th century and the 12th century that is very much the Muslim Golden Age. These writers absolutely, like, they were very much working with the original ideas of Plato and Aristotle. Again, they're medieval thinkers. They're trying to sort of, like, reconcile Plato and Aristotle's scholastic secular philosophy with the Quran, with their understanding of Muslim tradition. And I gotta stress, these guys are not alone. They are frequently working off of the back of Christian scholars working in the Muslim world, or Jewish scholars working in the Muslim world, because they are permitted to keep on working, especially in the 9th and 10th centuries before, you know, the Islamic philosophical movement really kicked off. A lot of the most important translations from Greek into Syriac or Arabic were conducted by Christian scholars who thought this was a priority. So scholars like Ibn Sina and Ibn Rushd and Al-Ghazali were, in many cases, polymaths. They were studying Aristotle, they were studying Plato, they were updating and, you know, expanding their understanding to the new Muslim worldview that they had, but they were also adapting this in terms of science. They were changing the way that, like, medicine was practiced. And, you know, the textbooks that the Muslims, and in particular Ibn Sina, wrote on the subject of health and anatomy were then adopted by Renaissance thinkers and sort of, like, turned into the basis for modern medical scholarship today. Muslim thinkers were the ones examining the heavens, inventing new telescopes for looking at the stars, and these are the telescopes that Galileo adapted during the Renaissance for his own studies into Renaissance science. And for that matter, Islamic mathematics, they borrowed their numeral system from the Hindus, who had already built up a pretty robust mathematical system of their own. But Islam very much pioneered the science of algebra. Notice how very much algebra sounds like a, you know, Muslim word or Muslim loan word, and very much changed the way that mathematics itself was conducted. Like, in part, they are the great traders. They brought the Hindu numerical system to the West, like you do, but at the same time, they updated it and changed things and made the algebraic system that Descartes would use to build his, you know, discourse on mathematics, and it would be the foundation of the calculus of Newton and beyond. So all of this is due to Muslim science and Muslim scholarly advances during this time period. Because of their wealth, because of the concentrations of wealth, all of these, you know, middle-class Muslim traders or scholars were given the luxury to practice these traditions, and Muslim kings and Muslim caliphs were able to concentrate wealth and turn their cities into great centers of learning. The Book of Wisdom, or Words of Wisdom, became this widely circulated Islamic text to basically every major Islamic library in the Islamic world. And anyone who, you know, professed an interest in studying this stuff could, if they had the money and had the free time. Which yields the great architectural achievements of the Islamic world. Like, admittedly, the Dome of the Rock is more of a classical sort of update than actually the product of any of these great Islamic scientific breakthroughs, just because it's, you know, a product of such an early period in Islamic history. But later mosques, especially those completed in the 9th century, or the frankly staggering Great Mosque of Cordoba, which was constructed and expanded throughout the 8th to 10th centuries, are almost certainly a product of the various Islamic mathematicians perfecting their craft and able to, like, create greater and greater masterpieces of mosque architecture. Now, again, like, mosques are sort of the main focal point, in the same way that cathedrals are the main sort of architectural wonder of the medieval European world. But I gotta stress that, like, again, as much as the principles are very clearly Islamic, with the mezuin, the sort of, like, tower that needs to be there in order to call people to worship, as well as, like, less of an emphasis on these big, impressive, you know, like, domes or large sort of, like, central spaces, and instead more interest in geometric patterns, more interest in sort of, like, mosaic and non-representational artwork, unlike, say, what you'd find in a you know, Catholic cathedral with their stained glass or iconographic representations of Christ or the Virgin Mary or whoever. Nonetheless, these are staggering works of mathematical precision, staggering architectural achievements, just with their own Muslim priorities. Like, being able to point the building towards Mecca so you can correctly direct everyone to their prayers, or with the mezouin in place in order to, have somebody call to worship. These are absolutely masterpieces on the same order as Christian cathedrals and any of the great classical works that we've seen in the past. But where the Romans were interested in aqueducts and bridges, where the Greeks were interested in temples, the Muslims are interested in mosques, and that's where our great architectural accomplishments tend to lie. Now, as far as the Crusades go, the Muslims are not terribly perturbed by them. Like, yeah, losing a little territory, and especially losing Jerusalem, is a blow. But, again, at this particular era in the 11th and 12th centuries, there's a lot of sort of dissent and sort of like internal conflict happening within the Muslim world. The Fatimid Caliphate still exists, but is gradually sort of on the decline. Much of it will be replaced by the Ayyubid Caliphate, which is sort of founded by the same Saladin who reconquers Jerusalem and sort of like draws the Third Crusade to a close. The Seljuk Turks are sort of threatening the remainder of the Abbasid dynasty, and at the same time, the early Ottomans are starting to gather in like the Byzantine Empire close to Constantinople. So the Islamic world is very much fracturing. Like, as much as we saw the sort of centralized government of the Umayyads following the Rashidun and the early Muslim caliphs, by this period in the 11th century, like, the idea of Muslim unity has very much sort of, like, disintegrated. They are still very powerful, they are still very rich, but they are powerful and rich because of their confederation, because they are a community of like believers, and because their trade tends to continue to endure even when there are sort of internecine conflicts or problems between ruling groups within the Muslim world. But this does very much come to a close in the 13th century. Like, the Abbasid dynasty is very violently and quickly brought to a halt when Genghis Khan and the Mongol hordes invade Baghdad in 1258 and start sort of sweeping through the Muslim world. Now, again, the Mongols are also pretty religiously tolerant. They're pretty okay with the Muslims practicing their own faith, and many of the Mongol leaders end up converting to Islam and will sort of, like, rule in much of the Islamic world, much of the Islamic heartland for, decades, centuries to come, even. Islam will thrive, and the Islamic culture will thrive even under Mongol rule. But because Baghdad fights so hard against the Mongol invasion, because the Mongols don't have any history or respect for sort of like cultural innovation, philosophy, scholarship, history, and so on, that means that a lot of the great Islamic cultural achievements, a lot of the great Islamic scientific achievements, a lot of the great Islamic texts are lost during this period. Like I said at the beginning of our discussion, that when, like the early Muslim conquerors take over Alexandria is pretty happy to turn themselves over, and it is very unlikely that the Library of Alexandria burned during this period. What I will say is that the Library of Baghdad did burn, and that's the greater tragedy here. At that point, Baghdad was still the center of the Abbasid Caliphate. The Abbasid Caliphate was still the sort of center of Muslim learning and scholarship. Baghdad was the jewel in the Islamic crown. And the sacking of Baghdad was truly destructive, truly ended this Islamic golden age and the Islamic scholarship that surrounds it. But it doesn't change the fact that Islam continues to thrive even after this. Ibn Battuta, a 14th century Islamic wanderer, I guess, decided to, go on his pilgrimage, and then decided to just never stop being on a pilgrimage. So he wandered all over the freaking world. He documented his journeys along the way. The Travels of Ibn Battuta are probably one of the greatest, travel journals in the history of the world, very much on par with the travels of Marco Polo. Heck, he traveled much farther and to way more places than Marco Polo did. And again, during the same period as Marco Polo, like during the Mongol rule of much of the Islamic world, the Hajj was still taking place. The pilgrimage to Mecca was still very much a priority in Muslim culture. So he performed his Hajj, and he just kept on going, wandering throughout the Muslim heartland, but also exploring the Arabian Peninsula all the way into, deep southern Africa, as well as exploring India and even getting into China at some points, as well as exploring Mali, which is where our guy Mansa Musa, the king in Timbuktu in the Malian Empire, which up till now we haven't even discussed, like, he just apparently decides, because he is a Muslim and because, you know, he's been talking to Ibn Battuta, like, he decides to go on the road. He's going to take the pilgrimage, go to Mecca, you know, as all good Muslims are supposed to. But as it happens, Timbuktu is where, like, some of the largest gold reserves in the world are located. So Mansa Musa is widely considered the richest man who ever lived, like, even by contemporary standards. Like, move over Elon Musk, this dude had more wealth even than you did. So his pilgrimage isn't just like he goes alone to Mecca. No, he brings his elephants, and he brings huge quantities of his court, like basically the entire royal court of Mansa Musa, stuffed with gold, just goes to Mecca, like, enriching every place they stop along the way. Like, it's just wild, the sort of, you know, riches and demonstrations of wealth that are at stake here. And as he does this sort of unprecedented journey, this unprecedented show of wealth. And all of which is kind of coming as a surprise to most of the Islamic world. Because while the trade routes do exist, and it's very much Malian gold that has been spreading around the empire for a long period of time, like, the idea that, you know, the Muslim conversion process had been this thorough, this rigorous, that this person's from so far outside the Arabic and Persian Muslim cultures would have this much wealth and this much authority and this much prestige walking into Mecca. Like, it's a heck of a thing to think about. We also have some great Islamic philosophers coming out of this period as well, like Ibn Khaldun here. Ibn Khaldun is very much in the Persian tradition of Muslim scholarship and philosophy, but his work, the Muqaddimah, I think I'm pronouncing that correctly, or Prolegomena as it's usually translated, was one of the greatest works of history and sort of like scholarship looking at the systems underlying the world. It's often considered one of the first early economic texts, and absolutely a rival to any of the great histories written at this point in history. Like, it is unprecedented in its scholarship and shows that Muslim culture and Muslim scholarship is very much alive and well here in the 14th century. As much as, you know, as much as the Mongols do not prioritize this and broke much of the sort of scholarly impetus, scholarship continues to thrive and great works are still happening, and the Muslim world is still thriving. Though maybe not in the same way that we would expect from an empire like the Roman Empire. But if anything, that's the message I want you to carry away with here. Empire isn't a sustainable form of government in many respects. Like, when one centralized location runs a giant swath of territory, it typically turns into a bureaucratic nightmare pretty quickly, the way that you do in ancient Rome. But when you have this loose confederation, when you tolerate this many different cultures, this many different perspectives, there is a sense in which you become more robust to outside threats. By practicing tolerance, by practicing patience, by practicing a kind of pluralism, you in fact encourage all these sorts of accomplishments in a way that isn't possible when you're, you know, like letting one person call all the shots for everyone. Now, this too kind of ends in the Ottoman Empire. As the Ottomans spread throughout Constantinople, as they spread throughout the Byzantine Empire, they spread into the primary Islamic world as well, taking over Mecca and Medina, taking over Alexandria and the Egyptian world, taking over much of the Persian world, and taking over much of like North Africa as well. I'm pretty sure Baghdad is included in the Tigris and Euphrates rivers there, so you can figure both Baghdad and Damascus are under the Ottoman control as well. So this becomes the new center of the Muslim world, and under the Ottomans, the Muslim culture and like the dynamism of Muslim pluralism, as I'm calling it here, probably very wrongly, the Muslim cosmopolitan world does kind of cease to be quite as cosmopolitan. But it does not change the fact that Islam will survive and Islam will thrive again. This is hardly the end of the story. It's just where we end ours. Again, General Humanities 1 only covers to supposedly 1400, and we're already bumping well into the 1450s when we start talking about the fall of Constantinople. But in my experience, General Humanities 2 doesn't typically cover the fall of Constantinople all that much, so all the more reason to talk about it here. So I hope that you've learned something from this. Again, like, I find this stuff fascinating to study. This was a tough PowerPoint for me to put together because I am, like, cobbling together the research I've done from, like, a dozen different other studies and a bunch of books and other works that, you know, I've never actually, like, put into one place before. I imagine I'm getting a lot of the facts wrong. I'm getting a lot of the information wrong. If you're looking at this on YouTube and you have a better source, by all means, connect it in the comments. Like, show me something that I can use to make this lecture, to make this discussion better when I approach my classes in the future. I am eager to learn more about the Byzantine world, learn more about the Muslim world, to learn more about this era in history, because it is so under-discussed and underappreciated. And if you are on the other side, someone who has never heard any of this, I hope that you start to appreciate it as I have, that I've fired your imagination and fired your interest as well. Because the more we hunger to learn about this period, the more resources will exist that will help to reveal and expose it. Like, Greek scholarship isn't necessarily hurting for archaeological funds to go on digs in ancient Greece or in the greater ancient Greek world. Roman scholarship is never hurting for more information or more places to dig. But my understanding is, in order to get any traction in the Muslim world, in order to study medieval Muslim anything, it's a huge uphill battle. So the more that demand exists, the more interest we have in our Muslim heritage, the more we will be able to see that start to change. And I say that intentionally, our Muslim heritage. This is as much a part of the story of the West as anyone. And I do not want to co-opt Islam to my own purposes. I don't want to turn it into part of my culture in that way. Like, I hope that I am being respectful of the boundaries here. But I also want us to understand, as Westerners, as people profiting from, you know, the legacy of the Muslim trade network, the legacy of Muslim scholarship, the legacy of Muslim, you know, cosmopolitanism, I want us to recognize our indebtedness to this culture, to recognize that in some sense it is our culture, that we are citizens of the world, and that this is a major moment in world history. It is not just the religious history of a, you know, group of believers, however numerous. It is all of ours. This was the era of Islam. This was the era that the Muslim world was the world in a very real sense. Every bit as much as the Romans or the Greeks or the Persians or the Babylonians were at one point in history. So let's own it. Let's talk about it. Let's incorporate this into our discussion, and not just in that throwaway chapter in your Western Civ textbook. Let's make this an actual discussion. Now, next time, alas, violating all of this, admittedly, we are going to talk about some passages of the Quran, and I'm probably going to stumble over those as well. But after this, we move on to looking at medieval Christianity. We're going to spend another PowerPoint presentation talking about the medieval Christians. We're going to look at some examples of medieval Christian literature, specifically the poems Serve Orfeo and Dante's Divine Comedy. But that's it, folks. Like, that's where we hit 1400 and we run out of gas for this class. So we are rapidly approaching the end. Like, our sort of hitting the chronological border of our class here was not a mistake. That's intentional. We're wrapping it up, folks. So next time we look at the medieval Christians and we see what they are up to. I look forward to talking about it with you soon.